Good evening and welcome. Tonight, I invite you to sit back, relax, and let the eerie world of the unknown unfold around you. As you settle in, try to feel the room grow colder, the shadows lengthen, and the faintest whisper brush across the corners of your mind. For those who enjoy a touch of the uncanny before sleep, tonight promises to deliver experiences that will linger long after the lights go out. Each story I share has been carefully selected. True encounters that have left witnesses stunned, unnerved, and questioning the very fabric of reality. These are not the stories meant to shock and fade into memory. These are the ones that burrow deep into your subconscious, quietly gnawing at the edges of comfort, turning the familiar into the unknowable. Our first story begins in a small town, unremarkable in every way except for what its residents refused to speak of. The town had a long history, stretching back to the early 1800s, when settlers claimed the land and began cultivating a life rooted in simplicity. But beneath the surface of cobblestone streets and well-worn houses lay secrets that not even the oldest families dared to whisper. One resident, a young woman named Eleanor, had moved into an old Victorian house with her husband. The house had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, its once grand facade now weathered and sagging. From the moment Eleanor stepped across the threshold, she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. The air inside was heavy, almost viscous, and it carried the faint smell of smoke long extinguished. At first, she chalked it up to the house being old, imagining the creaks and groans as the inevitable settling of an aged structure. But soon, things escalated beyond explanation. It started subtly. As most true hauntings do, doors would open and close without warning. A staircase would creak under the pressure of invisible footsteps. Eleanor would hear whispers in rooms that should have been empty. Voices so soft they could almost be mistaken for the wind through the cracks in the walls. One night, as she lay awake, she noticed shadows moving across the ceiling in patterns that no one could have cast. It was then that she realized she was not alone. Attempting to rationalize the occurrences, she spoke aloud, telling herself that it was her imagination, a trick of the mind induced by stress or fatigue. But the shadows began to respond, stretching and twisting in ways that mimicked her words, as though mocking her very attempt at reason. Eleanor's husband, though skeptical, began to witness the events himself. Objects moved in broad daylight. Photographs were found turned face down despite him remembering placing them carefully on shelves. A cold presence would follow him as he walked through the house, causing his skin to prick and his breath to fog in rooms that weren't even cold. The most unnerving moment occurred one evening when he found his wife staring blankly at a corner of the living room. She didn't blink, she didn't breathe audibly, and her eyes seemed fixed on a point that didn't exist. Then, in a whisper that wasn't her own voice, the words came, "Leave now or stay forever." The couple had never heard anything like it. Fear rooted them in place. Yet the words carried a weight, a command that was impossible to ignore. Weeks turned into months, and the activity only intensified. Eleanor began to notice marks on the walls, shallow scratches that spelled no discernible words but seemed deliberately placed, as if someone or something was trying to communicate. At night, the temperature would plummet, icy tendrils creeping along the floors, creeping under the doors, surrounding them in a frost that existed only in the immediate space around them. Sleep became a distant memory. Dreams were invaded by the same shadows that haunted the house by day, and each morning brought a new piece of the puzzle. A chair overturned, a window left wide open, a painting slightly askew. The cumulative weight of these events eroded the couple's sense of safety. They were living in a home that should have been familiar, yet each passing day made it increasingly alien, almost hostile. One evening, Eleanor found herself drawn to the attic, a space they had avoided since moving in. The door, once firmly shut, now creaked open with minimal effort. Inside, dust particles hung like suspended stars in the weak light filtering through a small window. As she stepped inside, a chill surged up her spine, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed. In the corner of the attic stood an old trunk, covered in cobwebs and sealed with a rusted lock. Compelled by something she could not name, Eleanor opened the trunk. Inside were objects from a time long forgotten. Faded letters, photographs of unknown faces, and a diary bound in cracked leather. As she opened the diary, the words on the first page seemed to shimmer, almost alive, describing the very house she now inhabited, the very rooms, and even referencing her by name in entries written decades before she was born. Panic surged through her. How could this be? Was it mere coincidence? Or had some force been preparing her for this moment all along? The couple decided to seek help. Paranormal investigators were brought in, but even they were cautious. EMF readings spiked erratically. Cameras captured fleeting shadows that moved against the laws of physics, and cold spots developed that couldn't be explained by drafts or ventilation. Attempts to cleanse the house with traditional rituals yielded temporary relief, but the phenomena always returned, stronger and more insistent. Eventually, Eleanor and her husband made the difficult decision to leave the house. Selling it to strangers who, according to local lore, also reported disturbances. The house stood as a monument to the unseen, a reminder that some spaces are never truly abandoned, and that the past, with all its unresolved tragedies, can linger far longer than anticipated. This first story sets the stage for the kind of experiences that will follow. Events grounded in reality, yet touched by forces that defy comprehension. Transitioning from this chilling encounter, our next story shifts focus to a different kind of terror. One that is less rooted in place and more in the realm of personal experience. Unlike the first, which emphasized a haunted location, this story examines the ways in which unseen entities can manipulate perception and memory, turning the familiar into something unrecognizable. a young man named Aaron had been exploring an old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of his hometown. Rusting rides leaned at impossible angles. Carousel horses frozen mid-gallop, and the faint scent of decayed popcorn lingered in the air. Aaron's intention was simple: document the location for a photography project. However, what began as a routine exploration quickly turned into an ordeal that would challenge his understanding of reality. Aaron noticed that certain areas of the park seemed to repeat themselves. Paths he had walked just moments before appeared again, as if he had never passed through them. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, but no matter which direction he approached, it seemed to shift, always remaining just out of reach. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, defying the time of day, and faint laughter echoed from nowhere, growing louder as he moved toward it, then fading abruptly. Panic began to set in as he realized the park was no longer behaving according to the rules of the physical world. The air felt thick, almost viscous, and a constant low hum vibrated through the ground, though no machinery was operational. Aaron's sense of direction disintegrated, replaced by a growing awareness that he was being guided or herded by an unseen presence. By the time night fell, Aaron had lost track of how far he had wandered. He stumbled across a small, dilapidated funhouse, its mirrors cracked and fogged with age. Inside, the reflections did not match his movements. A figure appeared behind him in the mirror, but when he turned, the hallway was empty. A cold hand seemed to brush against his shoulder, and he spun around, finding nothing. Panic surged, and he ran blindly through the maze of corridors, only to emerge into the exact same clearing he had started from hours earlier. It was as if the park itself was alive, reshaping and manipulating his reality. The experience left Aaron questioning whether he had truly been somewhere, or whether he had been caught in a loop orchestrated by a malevolent force. His photographs later revealed anomalies that could not be explained. Figures appearing in shadows that had no physical counterpart, and distortions in the frames that seemed almost deliberate, as though the park itself had been captured alongside him. Aaron's ordeal was a vivid reminder that paranormal experiences are not confined to haunted houses or cemeteries. Sometimes they exist wherever the boundaries of reality are most fragile. Whether it is a place abandoned by humans or a structure long forgotten, the ability of entities to distort perception, induce fear, and manipulate the environment remains consistent. For Aaron, the amusement park would forever remain a symbol of the unknown, alluring, yet undeniably terrifying. The next story takes us into the realm of personal encounters, where the terror is not bound to a location but attached to people themselves, to those we believe we know. In a small Midwestern town, a young woman named Lydia had just moved into her first apartment, a modest space above an old bakery that had long since closed. It was the kind of place that seemed cozy and unremarkable during the day. Yet, as the sun set and shadows stretched across the walls, it revealed itself as something far less benign. Lydia enjoyed the quiet solitude of her evenings, but soon, subtle signs began to suggest that she was not entirely alone. The first night, she noticed the faint smell of smoke in the living room. She had no appliances running, and the smell vanished whenever she investigated. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to residual scents from the old bakery. But then came the footsteps. These were not ordinary creaks or groans from the building settling. These were deliberate, heavy steps that moved across her apartment, pausing outside her bedroom door only to vanish moments later. At first, Lydia tried to rationalize, assuming perhaps a neighbor had made their way into her unit by accident. But the footsteps would continue, even when she was home alone. Often at the same times each night, almost as if a schedule had been set by someone unseen. The most unsettling moments were not the noises themselves, but the feeling they left behind. A cold, heavy presence that seemed to lean against her chest as she tried to breathe, making every inhalation a conscious effort. It was an unshakable dread, an invisible weight that followed her from room to room, refusing to be ignored. One evening, while preparing dinner, Lydia caught sight of movement from the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, expecting to see an intruder, but there was nothing. However, she noticed the reflection in the kitchen window. A faint, shadowy figure standing in the doorway behind her. She spun around again, and the room was empty. Her pulse raced, and she struggled to maintain a semblance of composure. Nights became a cycle of anxiety and exhaustion. Every creak, every distant thump set her heart racing, and every glance toward dark corners carried the weight of anticipation. Eventually, Lydia installed cameras in the apartment. When she reviewed the footage, she found herself staring at images that defied explanation. Shadowy shapes moving in corners, lights flickering on and off without any discernible cause, and, most chillingly, the faint outline of a person standing near her bed as she slept. The figure seemed to watch her, almost patiently, waiting. The paranormal activity escalated when Lydia's cat, usually calm and aloof, began hissing and growling at empty spaces. It would crouch low, back arched, ears flattened, staring at the corners of the room where Lydia saw nothing. Objects that she placed carefully in one spot would move across the apartment, sometimes appearing in entirely different rooms. The sense of being watched never abated, and her mental and emotional state began to fray. Friends tried to reassure her, attributing the phenomena to stress, lack of sleep, or imagination. But even when they spent nights at the apartment, some reported seeing shadows move in the periphery of their vision, or hearing faint whispers that stopped when they turned to investigate. Lydia realized she was no longer living alone. Not in the conventional sense, but in a shared space with something whose intentions she could not discern. The climax of Lydia's ordeal occurred one late autumn night. She awoke to the sensation of her sheets being pulled, a pressure on her chest as though something heavy had pressed down. Gasping for breath, she looked toward the foot of the bed and saw a dark form, taller than a man, featureless, yet exuding a palpable malevolence. In a voice that was not her own, she heard the words, "You don't belong here." The entity seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat, each beat echoing through her body like a drum of fear. Frozen in terror, she could neither move nor speak. Time itself seemed suspended, and the air around her thickened, pressing into her lungs and ears. When morning came, Lydia found herself alone. Yet the oppressive sense lingered, as though the entity had only paused its presence rather than departed. It was a lesson in the subtlety of true haunting. The absence of noise or movement does not guarantee safety. Moving from personal encounters to the more enigmatic, our next story focuses on an object, a relic that should have been harmless, but carried with it a malevolent energy that transformed its surroundings. A man named Simon inherited an old wooden chest from his grandmother, who had recently passed. The chest was beautifully crafted, adorned with intricate carvings of flowers and abstract patterns, seemingly innocent to any observer. Simon, intrigued by its age and beauty, brought it into his apartment without hesitation. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. He placed clothing and books inside and went about his daily routine. But soon, strange occurrences began. Items that Simon had stored in the chest would appear on the floor outside the chest, often broken or in odd arrangements. The air around the chest felt colder, and the faint scent of decay seemed to emanate from the wood itself. One evening, Simon awoke to the sound of scratching. It started softly, almost imperceptible, but grew louder with each passing minute. When he investigated, he found the chest vibrating as if something inside it was struggling to escape. Shadows danced across the room in erratic patterns, and the lights flickered in a rhythm that seemed synchronized with the scratching. Attempting to remove the chest, Simon discovered it was inexplicably heavy, far heavier than its construction should allow. No matter how he lifted or moved it, it resisted, almost as if bound to the floor by unseen chains. Days passed, and the activity escalated. Neighbors reported strange noises emanating from his apartment, including low, guttural groans that did not resemble any human or animal sound. Simon was no longer merely witnessing phenomena. He had become part of it. The final confrontation with the chest occurred during a stormy night. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in brief, stark bursts. During one such flash, Simon saw, etched into the side of the chest, faint symbols that had not been there before. They pulsed faintly, glowing with a light that seemed almost alive. Compelled by curiosity and fear, Simon opened the chest one last time. Inside, he found a series of objects he did not recognize. A small bundle wrapped in cloth, a cracked mirror, and several letters in a language he could not read. As he touched the letters, the room seemed to constrict, walls moving imperceptibly closer. the air thickening into a suffocating fog. Panicked, Simon sealed the chest and moved it to a storage unit, far from his apartment. Even there, the vibrations persisted, faint at first, but growing with every passing day. It was a reminder that some objects are vessels, containers not of matter, but of intent, capable of extending their influence far beyond their physical presence. As we transition from haunted objects back to haunted places, the next story unfolds in a small Pennsylvania town, where the ruins of abandoned buildings and forgotten mines form the backdrop for a tale that is both historical and supernatural. In this town, the residents speak in hushed tones about the old coal mines that snake beneath their homes. Mines that have caused buildings to collapse and streets to sink over the decades. One family, the Harrisons, moved into a house situated above a network of these long abandoned tunnels. At first, the ground seemed solid, the house stable, and life ordinary. But soon, odd occurrences began to plague the household. Heavy furniture would shift slightly overnight, often with no explanation, and walls developed new cracks that seemed to form symbols rather than random patterns. The family began to hear faint whispers emanating from beneath the floorboards. Voices that carried words almost recognizable, but always distorted, as if warped through time and earth. The haunting intensified when the children reported seeing figures in the hallways, shadowy outlines of miners from generations past, their faces obscured by soot, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The adults initially dismissed these sightings as imagination or children's play. However, one evening, a portion of the basement floor collapsed suddenly, revealing an active section of the tunnel below. The darkness within impossibly deep. A low hum resonated from the depths, vibrating through the bones of anyone nearby. Panic overtook reason as the family realized that their home was not simply built over abandoned mines, but over something alive in the dark. Something that did not belong to the realm of the living. From that day forward, the house became a place of avoidance. Even after selling it, neighbors reported faint lights in the basement at night and sounds that suggested the tunnels were far from dormant. The next story we delve into takes us far from haunted houses and objects into the realm of the truly inexplicable. Encounters with beings or entities that defy any earthly explanation. For Daniel, a college student living in the quiet outskirts of a small town in Ohio, what began as a simple night walk quickly transformed into an experience he would never forget. Daniel often took evening strolls through a nearby forest, enjoying the solitude and the crisp night air. On one particular night, the moon hung full and low, illuminating the path with an almost supernatural glow. As he walked, he felt the familiar crunch of leaves beneath his feet. But soon, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Another set of footprints appeared beside his own, identical in size and spacing, though no one was walking with him. He paused, heart racing, listening for any sound, but the forest remained eerily silent. As Daniel continued, the footprints mirrored his every step. When he slowed, they slowed. When he quickened, they quickened. Panic began to rise within him, yet curiosity compelled him forward. The trees seemed to shift subtly, guiding him deeper into the forest, into areas he had never explored. Shadows twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that could almost be recognized as faces or figures, only to dissolve when he tried to focus. Suddenly, a voice called his name, soft, distant, and simultaneously intimate. Daniel spun around, straining his eyes, but there was no one there. The voice repeated, slightly closer this time, and he realized it wasn't coming from a particular direction, but seemed to resonate from the forest itself. Every instinct told him to run, yet his legs felt heavy, reluctant, as if the forest wanted him to stay. Hours seemed to pass, though time had no meaning in that moment. Daniel noticed a faint light between the trees, a soft blue luminescence that pulsed gently, almost breathing. Drawn to it, he approached with caution. And the air grew unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that seeps through clothing and bone alike. When he reached the source, he saw an entity that defied understanding. It was vaguely humanoid but translucent, with no distinguishable facial features. Its presence radiated something both terrifying and sorrowful, a duality that made Daniel's mind struggle to comprehend. He felt a strange connection, as if the entity wanted to communicate, but language itself was inadequate. The light pulsed faster, and a sense of urgency filled the clearing, urging him to leave, yet not violently, more as a warning. Daniel stepped back, and the figure dissolved into mist, leaving only the faint glow lingering in the trees. Daniel's experience didn't end in the forest. Over the following days, he began seeing glimpses of the entity in reflective surfaces, windows, mirrors, even the screen of his phone. Sometimes it appeared for only a fraction of a second, just enough to feel its presence, to know it was there. Sleep became difficult. Dreams were invaded by the same pulsing blue light and faceless figure. He tried rational explanations, from hallucinations to stress-induced visions, but he couldn't shake the consistency of the experience. Friends and family reported nothing unusual, reinforcing the isolation of his encounters. Eventually, Daniel sought out a local historian who knew the area well. The historian revealed that the forest had long been considered a place of mysterious disappearances and strange phenomena, dating back centuries. While there were no records of entities exactly like what Daniel described, the forest itself had always carried a reputation as a liminal space, where the veil between worlds thinned, and the ordinary laws of nature could not be trusted. From the forest to a city environment, our next story focuses on the urban paranormal. where disturbances manifest amid everyday life. In a downtown office building in Mississippi, an employee named Rachel began experiencing odd occurrences shortly after moving into the third floor of a historic building that had once housed a law office, a restaurant, and various private homes over decades. At first, it was subtle. Footsteps echoing in hallways when no one else was present, objects misplaced, and doors that locked or unlocked seemingly at random. The strange events escalated to auditory phenomena. Voices whispering in rooms that should have been empty, faint knocks on walls, and electronics behaving erratically. Rachel initially ignored these occurrences, attributing them to the quirks of an old building. But when co-workers reported similar experiences, the situation became harder to dismiss. One evening, two co-workers, David and Ronnie, were returning from a local event when Rachel was the first to arrive back at the office. The front door was locked, which seemed odd, but she assumed Ronnie had already entered. However, when she glanced up, she noticed Ronnie approaching from the sidewalk, wearing the same clothes he had worn at work hours earlier. The incongruence unnerved her, yet she hesitated to speak. As she entered the building, the temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and the air felt dense, almost suffocating. They later discovered that the building's third floor contained areas previously sealed off, remnants from when it had been a private home and later a law office. The overlapping histories seemed to generate a residual energy that manifested unpredictably. Over time, these disturbances became more pronounced, suggesting not a single haunting, but multiple presences, each tied to past occupants and events. Rachel and her colleagues attempted rational investigation. Security cameras were checked, floors swept for drafts, and electricians examined wiring for anomalies. All physical explanations failed to account for the phenomena. Audio recordings captured indistinct voices, often repeating words like "leave" and "help." Even when the building was vacant, shadows were observed moving independently of light sources, sometimes vanishing when approached. The cumulative effect left employees unnerved, affecting concentration and morale. Eventually, management installed monitoring equipment and consulted paranormal investigators who confirmed unusual electromagnetic readings and temperature fluctuations inconsistent with natural causes. The building, though functional, remained a nexus of unexplained events, demonstrating that the mundane spaces we occupy daily can harbor histories and presences that refuse to remain hidden. Now, let us shift from buildings to the more intimate experiences tied to family and personal history. The next story recounts the unsettling experience of a man named Michael, whose childhood home carried a legacy of secrets that revealed themselves in disturbing ways. Michael's family home had been passed down for generations, its walls bearing witness to countless events, both joyful and tragic. From a young age, he noticed peculiar phenomena. Objects moved inexplicably. Doors would open and close on their own, and voices spoke from rooms long abandoned. These occurrences were subtle at first, almost gentle, yet persistent, embedding themselves into his daily life. As Michael grew older, the patterns became more pronounced, suggesting a deliberate intelligence at work, something keenly aware of the family's presence and actions. The pivotal moment came when Michael revisited a box of childhood items, including letters, photographs, and trinkets he had forgotten. Among them was a small carved figurine that seemed innocuous but exuded a presence he could not ignore. Holding the figurine, Michael experienced a rush of sensations: fear, nostalgia, and an inexplicable connection to moments in his past he could not consciously recall. That night, he awoke to find the figurine on his nightstand, though he was certain he had placed it elsewhere. Whispered words filled the room, soft but insistent, urging him to uncover family secrets long buried. Over the following weeks, events escalated. Furniture shifted, lights flickered, and shadows moved with purpose. Each experience revealed fragments of the home's history, hints of tragedies and decisions that had left their imprint on the physical space. It became clear to Michael that the house itself was a repository of memory, amplified into the supernatural, and that he was being guided or tested by forces that existed beyond ordinary perception. Our next story transports us to the desolate landscape of rural New England, in Alesnender, where isolation amplifies fear and the ordinary takes on an uncanny edge. A man named Thomas had recently purchased a small farmhouse on the outskirts of a forgotten village. The property had been abandoned for decades, its paint peeling and wooden beams sagging under the weight of time. Locals spoke of the house with hushed tones, hinting at accidents and disappearances. But Thomas, pragmatic and adventurous, dismissed these tales as superstition. He moved in, determined to restore the house to its former charm. However, almost immediately, he sensed that the farmhouse was not as empty as he had imagined. Nights brought the subtle sounds of movement, footsteps on the creaking floors, doors opening without wind, and a low, constant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. At first, Thomas tried to rationalize these occurrences. The house was old after all, and settling noises were common. Yet, the frequency and specificity of the events made normal explanations increasingly untenable. Objects would reappear in places he had never left them. A rocking chair, which Thomas had pushed aside one afternoon, would be found in motion in the corner of the parlor. Windows would rattle even in calm weather, and lights flickered at irregular intervals. The most unnerving aspect was the sensation of being observed. Thomas felt eyes on him in moments of solitude, an invisible presence that followed him room to room. He tried recording the house using a camera, hoping to capture evidence of these disturbances. But each morning, he reviewed footage that offered no clear answers. only vague, shifting shadows and occasional flickers of light that seemed to have no source. The intensifying activity eventually extended into Thomas's dreams. Nightmares became vivid and unrelenting, each depicting scenes from the house in impossible configurations. Walls stretched to impossible heights, hallways looped endlessly, and doors opened into rooms that had never existed. He would awaken, heart pounding, to find objects from his dreams inexplicably positioned in the waking world. The boundary between dream and reality blurred, leaving Thomas uncertain of what was real. Friends and family began to notice changes in his demeanor. He became withdrawn, hesitant to discuss the occurrences, yet visibly shaken at times when seemingly minor anomalies took place. The farmhouse, it seemed, had begun to exert influence beyond the physical, intruding upon consciousness itself. One particularly harrowing night, Thomas was awakened by a noise he could not place. The sound was rhythmic, like footsteps pacing across the hallway. But when he investigated, there was no one there. As he returned to his bedroom, he noticed an apparition standing near the doorway, a figure indistinct in form, yet radiating a palpable malevolence. Thomas froze, caught between fear and disbelief. The figure moved toward him slowly, deliberately, and the air grew thick and suffocating. The temperature dropped sharply, frost forming on the edges of the wooden floorboards. Thomas attempted to retreat, but found himself immobilized, paralyzed by a force that seemed to emanate from the figure itself. Hours later, he awoke to find the room as it had always been, the figure gone, leaving only a lingering cold that would not dissipate for days. It was clear that the presence was not merely haunting the structure. It was engaging with him directly, aware of his fear, and perhaps feeding upon it. This encounter marked the beginning of a prolonged period of investigation. Thomas sought out local historians, paranormal experts, and anyone familiar with the region's haunted history. He learned that the farmhouse had once belonged to a family plagued by misfortune, with multiple untimely deaths recorded over several generations. The land itself had been the site of disputes and tragedies, leaving an imprint of sorrow and unrest. Experts suggested that such energy could linger, creating patterns of disturbance that interact with those sensitive to them. Thomas attempted cleansing rituals, protective charms, and spiritual consultations, yet the phenomena persisted. Each action seemed to elicit a reaction, as though the presence was testing boundaries, asserting its dominance, and reminding him that the house and what dwelled within it would not be easily subdued. Transitioning from rural isolation to urban hauntings, the following story explores the experiences of a man named Simon, who encountered paranormal activity tied not to a house, but to a location imbued with personal significance. Simon had grown up near an old railway station, long since abandoned and overgrown with weeds. As a teenager, he and friends would explore the derelict buildings, fascinated by the decay and history. One evening, Simon returned alone, drawn by a nostalgic sense of curiosity. As he wandered through the station, he noticed unusual patterns in the shadows cast by the remnants of the platform and waiting rooms. Shapes seemed to stretch unnaturally, almost like they were alive, and a low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and floor. The sensation of being watched became immediate and intense. Simon could not shake the feeling that the station itself had eyes, observing, judging, and perhaps guiding his every step. Simon's exploration revealed increasingly bizarre phenomena. Doors that should have been locked swung open of their own accord. Rusted equipment shifted position, as if recently used. Faint voices echoed from the tunnels beneath the platform, calling his name in whispers that were both inviting and threatening. Simon experienced a series of brief blackouts, each followed by subtle changes in his surroundings. A clock missing from the wall, graffiti altered, objects subtly rearranged. The longer he remained, the more distorted the environment became, as if the station existed partially in another dimension, a place where time and space bent to the will of unseen forces. Simon's fear escalated into terror when he glimpsed figures, humanoid but incomplete, almost ghostly, standing at impossible angles in doorways and archways. They would vanish when approached, leaving behind only the lingering sensation of cold, presence, and observation. Over time, Simon documented these events meticulously. He captured photographs, audio recordings, and detailed notes on each experience. Yet the anomalies defied rational explanation. Shadows appeared in photographs without corresponding objects. Audio revealed low, guttural whispers, fragmented and unintelligible, yet unmistakably deliberate. Simon shared his experiences with local authorities and paranormal experts, all of whom acknowledged the unusual nature of the activity, but could provide no concrete explanation. It became clear that the station was more than merely abandoned. It had become a nexus of energy, a location where the past and present intersected in ways that human understanding could not fully grasp. Simon's experience reminds us that hauntings are not limited to structures of habitation. They can exist wherever history, memory, and unresolved energy converge. Finally, Section 4 brings us to a chilling account rooted in family history and the power of unexplained premonition. A young man named Robert had spent his early adolescence fascinated by Ouija boards and the idea of communicating with spirits. One night, he and a close friend decided to experiment, asking personal questions in the hopes of eliciting verifiable responses. At first, it was light-hearted, almost playful, a game to test curiosity and belief. But as the session progressed, The board spelled out information Robert could not possibly have known. Names, locations, and events that seemed impossible to foresee were revealed, including the identity of a parent whom he had never met. For Robert, the experience was both exhilarating and terrifying, a stark reminder that some truths may be accessed through means beyond conventional understanding. Months later, he discovered that the board had, in fact, revealed information that had been hidden from him for years, confirming the eerie accuracy of the session. The lingering impact of such experiences demonstrates the diverse forms in which the paranormal can manifest. It is not always a haunting of place, nor solely a disturbance caused by objects. Sometimes it is an interaction that transcends normal perception, bridging the seen and unseen, the known and the hidden. For Robert, the Ouija board became more than a toy. It was a gateway, a conduit, and a warning, an early lesson in the depth and complexity of forces beyond comprehension. Each story we have explored tonight, from haunted houses to objects, forests, and premonitions, shares common threads: the intrusion of the inexplicable into ordinary life, the subtle manipulation of perception, and the relentless questioning of reality itself. These experiences remind us that the world is larger and stranger than we often allow ourselves to believe. As our final story tonight, we return to the subtle, lingering presence that can exist even in the most mundane settings. A woman named Clara had always felt a strange sense of unease in her childhood home, an old farmhouse that had been in her family for generations. Though nothing overtly terrifying had occurred, she often felt watched, and occasional whispers floated through the hallways when no one else was around. Years later, after moving away, Clara discovered that her family had unknowingly built their home atop a small, long-forgotten burial ground. The realization brought clarity to the lifelong tension she had felt, an invisible awareness, a presence observing, guiding, and sometimes warning. Clara's story reminds us that the paranormal is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is quiet, persistent, and intimate, embedding itself into the very fabric of our lives. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember, the world is full of unseen watchers waiting patiently, silently, and endlessly.